the Psych in Business podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you today to my guest, a clinical psychologist who is also a retired federal prison warden with expertise in organizational health and cultural transformation. Her mission is to bring self-awareness, core values, and compassion to high-stakes, high-impact environments. She's, of course, Dr. Tamara Lyn. Dr. Lyn was an unusual fixture in the criminal justice world. Upon her retirement, she was one of only 4 psychologists appointed to the position of warden in the federal prison system and was one of very few female wardens. She led her institution through the COVID-19 pandemic by emphasizing creative problem solving and building the resilience of staff and inmates in the face of extreme stress. She exudes empathy, optimism, courage, and hope for a better future. Dr. Lyn is an elected member of the board of directors of the American Psychological Association, the world's largest membership organization for psychologists. She's one of fewer than 50 psychologists currently certified by the American Board of Professional Psychology as a specialist in organizational and business consulting psychology. She's also certified by the International Coaching Federation as an associate certified coach. Dr. Lyn graduated with honors from Harvard Radcliffe Colleges, where she majored in sociology and Afro-American studies. She earned her master's and doctorate degrees in psychology at the University of Michigan, one of the nation's top psychology programs. Dr. Lyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the kind introduction.
Well, this is such a great accomplishment. I am so interested to jump into the conversation with you, and so I'm just going to do that right away. I am fascinated by the fact that you are a psychologist and were also a federal prisons warden. So I usually ask people, how did you get into the world of business? But in this case, how did you get into the business of the federal prisons and to end up as a warden too?
Well, that was not my original plan. I actually started my clinical training expecting that I would specialize in child and family work. And I began my training and was able to see relatively early on that I am not enough of a kid at heart to do really good play therapy. I realized that working with young kids was not going to be the best for them or for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to explore other specialties. And I
Mm-hmm.
happened to have professors who were doing forensic work at the time. And I found myself doing some psychological assessments for the Wayne County court system. This would be Detroit, Michigan. When a judge would
Mm-hmm.
want to know what a young offender needed in terms of services and supports, I would go to detention centers around Detroit and interview and assess these kids. And
Mm-hmm.
I became really interested in the circumstances that might lead them to be in front of a judge and the circumstances that they might be going back to once they were discharged from the facility. Uh, but when I did those assessments and handed in my report, I did not know what ended up happening to the kids. And it
Mm-hmm.
felt very unresolved for me. And I realized what I wanted to do was to work with people in the criminal justice system at various stages of their experience, from the beginning of their experience with the system, the assessment phase, the diagnostic phase, but also be involved in the treatment and in the preparation to return home. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually drew from school for a year and took a second clinical internship at a state psychiatric prison in Michigan because I wanted to do the work and see if it was a good fit. And it turned out that it was. It turned out that I
Mm-hmm.
really enjoyed the challenges of the clinical work and of the setting. I had terrific supervision, and it really gave me a sense that what I was doing as a psychologist was making a difference for not only the people who were uh, in my care, but also to the families and communities that they would return to once they had finished their commitments. So it was not a direct path into corrections, but once I found it, I stayed in it for over 20 years, and then during the course of that time, did clinical work in several federal prisons, working with men, women at every security level, supporting staff as well, because it is
Mm-hmm.
very, very demanding work. And
Mm-hmm.
there reached a point where I wanted to explore my interests in how these little systems ran. And how do you keep the lights on? And how do you make
Mm.
sure that you are providing health care to thousands of people? How are you going to keep the uh, parking lot paved? And how do you manage security threats inside? Every aspect of how institutions ran was interesting to me. And I happened to
Mm-hmm.
work for other wardens who gave me opportunities that were not typical of psychologists in that system to become responsible for other
Mm-hmm.
areas. So I eventually transitioned out of direct clinical work and moved into executive roles. I was an associate warden at two facilities where I helped the warden to supervise staff and inmates and to run the facility. There was a period of time when I stepped out of the field and went
Mm-hmm.
to our central office in DC and was responsible for psychology services nationwide within the agency. And that was a terrific experience until I really missed the field and I asked to go back and work with staff and inmates directly again, which is how I landed a warden role. So I've been able to do many things within one agency, and it's been a really terrific experience.
That is such a fascinating story, and your journey is so interesting to see. How you started off with clinical, and even did clinical in the prison systems, but moved to more administrative leadership and management things. I'm wondering, what was that transition like for you? Because I've talked so many times about how it's so challenging when people go from doing clinical work or engineering or accounting or whatever technical job that you do to doing something that's more of leadership administrative. What was that like for you in the prison system?
It was challenging for a few reasons. First, I am a psychologist in a
Hmm.
system that is not always comfortable with the input of psychologists or the presence of
Yeah.
psychologists. It can
Hmm.
make people a bit uh, uncomfortable. And one of my challenges was to prove my value in those settings, to earn
Hmm.
their trust, to um, maintain my credibility, not
Hmm.
having come initially from a security background. So I had to really gain, like I said, trust and credibility as I went along. For those
And how
same
did you do that?
reasons,
How did
yeah,
you how did you
I,
earn
I
trust and credibility in an environment where that seems like it wouldn't be as receptive to psychological thoughts and input?
yeah. So the federal prison system is a little different than most state and local systems in that we are all correctional workers first, and we
Hmm.
train that way from day one. So I earned the trust by doing the work that
Hmm.
correctional officers did, that food service workers did, that health service
Hmm.
workers did. We have a common experience in terms of sharing risk, sharing responsibility. We all respond to emergencies. We all
Hmm.
address security threats in addition to doing whatever our specialty work may be. So I was shoulder to shoulder with people in emergency situations who I later was at a conference table with and having to solve a problem or
Hmm.
address a need. So you earn the trust and credibility by doing the work and being willing to share the risk and the responsibility. I would say though that being a psychologist, but and also being a woman in those environments was challenging
Hmm.
because in many of those settings, women were um, perhaps in areas of the institution that were outside of the secure perimeter and where inmates
Hmm.
were less likely to frequent. So um, you you have to be really good about maintaining personal boundaries and maintaining professionalism, and that will get tested uh,
Hmm.
over time. You just have to do the right thing when no one's looking.
That seems like a very stressful job, especially doing it as a woman. I'm sure in those environments where it's very male dominated. I'm interested in hearing more about when you became a warden, what that transition was like for you, especially right on the heels of COVID coming up, and then having to try to work in that environment. How did you navigate that?
Hmm. Well, I had ideas about transitioning into the warden role and bringing lots of resources to improve staff wellness and employee engagement. And I wanted to improve training, and I wanted to encourage people to be more psychologically minded. And I had those plans with no idea that the pandemic was approaching. I arrived in my new role in March of 2020, just as we were beginning to realize that we had an emergency on our hands. And it turns out that all of those goals were still relevant and perhaps even more relevant than during non emergency situations.
Hmm.
So it was a period of great uncertainty. We literally did not understand quite what we were dealing with in terms of how COVID was transmitted, how it was treated, what our precautions needed to be, and we had to learn about that as we went along. One of my gifts, I think, is that I am comfortable with uncertainty. I don't mind not knowing exactly what to do.
That's
And
a great gift to have.
there's a concept in psychology called learning agility, and learning
Hmm.
agility is the shorthand for it is this idea of knowing what to do when you don't know what to do,
Yeah.
being able to draw on past experience
Hmm.
and knowledge and be able to apply it to novel situations. And people
Yeah, that's
high
being
in learning
comfortable with the
agility,
uncomfortable. Hmm.
yes, yes, yes. So those of us who are high in learning agility are comfortable in novel situations. Sometimes we even seek them. And that, I think, got me through my correctional career. The novelty of the work,
Hmm.
every day being different, that was something that suited me and my personality really well. My challenge as the warden was to acknowledge other people's uncertainties, hesitations, fears, without appearing to be dismissive of them, because I shared them,
Hmm.
but I also was comfortable finding solutions to problems as we went along. So there is a balance as the leader between wanting to acknowledge legitimate worries and fears, but not
Hmm.
letting it keep people from finding solutions to unusual problems and getting through a crisis, right? So
Hmm.
I worked really hard to build people's confidence that they did have the knowledge and the resources to come up with novel solutions to problems. And also, this idea that we may try something, we may or may not find that it works, but it will help
Mm-hmm.
us to make the next decision, and
Mm-hmm.
that no experience is wasted, that everything is a learning experience to apply to the next unknown.
Yeah. I love that approach. The trial and error and everything. You learn from everything, right? Nothing is wasted. In the intro, I read that one of the things that you did was work to build resilience within the staff and the inmates. How do you do that in the inmates? I mean, I can understand the staff, but how did you accomplish that with the inmates?
Oh, that's a great question. I interacted with inmates a great deal, making
Mm-hmm.
rounds, being at meals. They had access to me, could ask me questions, could talk about concerns. Um, I tried to be quite accessible. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things you learn in corrections is that you may not feel like you are particularly noticeable or high profile, but people are observing you all the time and looking to see how you handle situations, how you carry yourself, how you speak to others. And in my case, I took that very seriously and I did my best.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that I was always successful, but I did my best to model stability, especially emotional stability, calm, um,
Mm-hmm.
maintaining respect for others, being openness to feedback, whether it was positive or negative, and
Mm-hmm.
not taking things terribly personally if somebody was unhappy with a decision I made or a choice that I made. So I receive feedback from folks, both on staff and in the inmate population, that having a steady presence
Mm-hmm.
helps to establish a norm that there is calm and that things are being handled to the best of our ability, and it helps to set a tone that other people
Mm-hmm.
will follow. So I try to use myself to model calm and resilience, patience. And again, I can't say that I was always successful, but I tried to be more
Well,
successful than not.
I can say, Tammy, that I know you personally, and I know people who know you, and one of the things that we all agree on is that you are the calmest person that we know. And you are the person that we would all love to have in a crisis when we're losing our heads, because you are absolutely calm. So I think that you were able to embody that really well. So I can agree with that. I'm also interested in hearing a little bit about the what you were able to bring from your psychological training and experience that helps you in this work. I know we've talked about resilience, we've talked about staying calm and communicating, all those things, those psychological factors. But what do you think from your training as a psychologist was most helpful to you?
Yes. One piece of my training that I believe was very helpful is this idea that as psychological scientists,
Mm-hmm.
we are open to information. In fact, we are always looking for information in case it disputes what we think we already understand. So I believe that being open to lots of streams of information and
Mm-hmm.
being able to sift through information and try to learn from what's available is an important approach to leadership, to crisis management, to being responsible for others. If we are always focused only on what we think we already know,
Mm-hmm.
we limit our exposure to new information that might help us, right?
Mm-hmm.
One flip side of that is that as scientists, we sometimes can get caught up in seeking more and more information before we make a decision or come to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I had to challenge myself on during the course of my career is being able to come to a point where I was comfortable making a decision and acting on what I knew at the time,
Mm-hmm.
not getting caught in analysis paralysis. Because
Mm-hmm.
for us as psychologists, the fun is the exploration and the learning of new things and finding new information.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have other people responsible for you, or when you're in an emergency, there does need to be a point where you pick a lane
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
develop a
Make a
plan
decision. Yeah.
and, make a decision. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the balance that I had to come to in my career. I would also say that over the course of my career, I discovered what's known as positive psychology. And I learned about mindfulness practices that really helped ground me when I was finding my environment too stimulating, or when I needed to ground myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I did my best to share those practices with other people that I worked with.
Yeah.
Things like gratitude practices were really important because it's easy to get focused on the challenges
Yeah.
and what you may not feel is going well, but it's important to appreciate what is going well, and the things that are supporting us in our journey. So
Yeah. Staying as
discovering positive
balanced.
psychology is important.
Yeah, that's a really great way of staying balanced. I like that. And sounds like so that was a really great career. And I know that you retired from that, but you are doing consulting and coaching now, and you have your own consulting company called High Ready Coaching and Consulting. Why that name? What's the significance of that name?
Oh, thank you for asking me that. So, having been in law enforcement for as long as I have, my mission now is to support people who are in fields like law enforcement that are high intensity, high demand, and really help them thrive in those settings while
Mm-hmm.
also maintaining their relationships with others, the values that brought them to their work, and really helping them to uh, feed their whole person while they're
Mm-hmm.
in this very demanding work. People in law enforcement and public safety will recognize the term high ready. It's the term that refers to a position that you take when you are on the firing line
Mm-hmm.
and you are armed and you are preparing to meet a threat, but you don't quite know where the threat is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in high ready, you are positioned such that you are most ready to meet your target. You have your hands at your chest, you're ready to take aim, and when you see your threat, you're able to extend your arms and meet your target. Uh, High ready is the optimal preparation for any crisis or
Mm-hmm.
emergency that you might face. And I wanted to be able to convey that coaching and consultation can help people to be better prepared for the challenges that they will ultimately face. And that preparation is key to success.
Yeah, I love that. I love that explanation, and thank you for sharing that insight into the world of law enforcement. I think that's what's really fantastic to be able to understand a little bit of that, and especially nowadays. I know there's a lot going on in law enforcement, and it's just I think it's such a great mission that you have to try to help in that arena and help with law enforcement and things like that. To Tammy, I want to be respectful of time, so I'm going to ask, with all the great things that you're doing, how do people get a hold of you? How do they contact you or follow you? Or what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Sure, sure. So I can be found at highreadycoaching.com. I'm also available on LinkedIn, under
Hmm.
High Ready Coaching and also under Tamara Lyn. And I'm eager to talk with people about how they, as individuals or as teams, can really bring values and psychological mindedness to their operations to really help not only people to be effective and productive, but also to protect their own wellness as they do demanding work of any kind. So there
Hmm.
are both
Hmm.
internal and external benefits from an approach that really takes into account how people learn and how people manage emotions under high stress situations.
Yeah, that's such a great. I mean, that's such a great mission, and I think even though your focus is law enforcement, businesses are high stress. Can be very high stress as well. So see your work applying broadly across many different areas. I'm going to ask you, Tammy, for a tip. I always ask everybody who comes on the show for a tip because we have you all on here, these experts. So, what tip would you give to people out there, either in business or law enforcement, in this current environment that everybody's in?
My tip would be that if you're able to tolerate some uncertainty, it
Hmm.
really will open you up to options and possibilities that were closed to you before. So I'd encourage people not to fear uncertainty, not to feel that being uncertain is a failing or an
Hmm.
inadequacy, but that uncertainty just tells us that there's more that we need to know or more that we need to learn. And it's an opportunity rather than anything to be ashamed of or
Mm.
avoid. I would lean into the uncertainty because that's where you discover new things.
That is, I love that. That is such good advice. I know it'd be hard for a lot of people, myself included, to lean into the uncertainty, right? Lean into that gray. A lot of people are very black and white. We like to know for certain what is or isn't, and so. But your advice is really on point, right? When you lean into the gray, that's where growth happens. That's where you're forced to expand yourself and to learn and grow. So that's really sage advice. I really think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, it's.
Leaning into uncertainty also forces us to connect with other people who may be able to
Mhm.
bring some clarity. And if we try to do the really hard work alone,
Mhm.
we're certain to limit our view. But if we lean into the help that other people can provide and the support that they can give, that is always a better option.
Absolutely. I think that's fantastic advice. And thank you so much for that advice. And thank you so much for coming on the show, Tammy. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. We'll have to have you come back. These are always so short. I'd love to hear some stories from your time as a warden. I'm sure you have many interesting ones to share.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And to all our listeners, thanks for listening. We hope to see you next time. Bye.